live. Let me just see. Excellent. Yes, we are. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Telegraph Hill Dwellers ballot discussion and education. My name is Nick Ferris. I am the treasurer for the Telegraph Hill Dwellers. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by our Assembly member, David Chiu, who will join us for the first half hour and guide us through the 12 state ballot measures. The second half hour will then be joined by Supervisor Peskin, who will take us through the 13 local ballot measures. If you have any questions, please submit them in the as we go in the chat bar at the right side of your window. What we'll do is after each measure, we will then pause and ask David or Aaron your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. You know, we've got only a little over a couple minutes per measure, which I know is very tight. So when you type the question, please also just list which ballot measure it's referencing, as that'll greatly help. All right, well, we're going to jump straight in. Assemblymember Chiu, I think on that note, the floor is yours.
Right on. Thanks, Nick. Hello, THD. Sorry we're not all in person, but I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. And with all the time I have to spend in Sacramento these days, I really miss the neighborhood and I miss seeing folks in and around the cafes and bars and restaurants, but hope everyone's doing well. So I know Aaron's going to be jumping on in 27 minutes. I've got 12 measures to go through, so I'm going to fly through it. And maybe what I'll do, I'll go through them all, and then if there are questions on different measures, people can ask them with the time we have left. So I will start with Proposition 14. Proposition 14 is about stem cell, and it's about investing in stem cell research. So in 2004, during I should say the last Republican president, and boy, does he actually Bush Jr. compare well to Trump these days. They refused to support stem cell research. And so we passed a ballot measure, Proposition 71, to issue bonds to support our state's STEM Research Institute. That money, 16 years later, has dried up. This is a bond measure to issue $5.5 million of new bonds to do stem cell research. I personally am supporting it. I think it's important that we do this research, but understand that people may wonder if we should spend on other things. That's really sort of the debate, but this is something that I do support. Let's move to Proposition 15, which from my perspective is possibly, I mean, they're all important, but this one is really important. Proposition 15 would amend Proposition 13 from the late 1970s. So some of you may remember Proposition 13 in 1978 effectively froze property tax increases. It was ostensibly geared toward property tax increases for residential properties owned by seniors, but the measure in Proposition 13, unbeknownst to a lot of folks, also captured commercial properties. And because of the definition of how commercial properties were taxed, commercial properties have effectively been able to escape billions of dollars of taxation because of the way the tax value is assessed. And so this measure, Proposition 15, would essentially close the corporate tax loopholes to allow us to tax commercial properties at the rate that they are owed. And it would bring estimated $12 billion of revenues that would help to go not only fill the hole that was created when it came to funding from Proposition 13. We've lost about 40% of our annual revenues to schools, community colleges, other important local services. But during this time of pandemic, during this time of recession, when we just at the state level had to balance a $54 billion budget deficit, $12 billion is going to go a long way to make sure we're investing in cities, counties, our city, our county, as well as schools, community college, etc. So that's Proposition 15. Let's move to Proposition 16, which I think arguably is probably the other most, from my perspective, one of the most important measures on this ballot. Proposition 16 would repeal, by the way, I realized I should take a step back. Sorry for the speed talking. I feel like I'm like speed dating through this conversation, even though I never speed dated before I got married. But Proposition 16, so most ballot measures deal with either past ballot measures or things that the state legislature has not grappled with or grappled with in a way that someone doesn't like. This measure would repeal a ballot measure from 24 years ago called Proposition 209, passed in 1996, which banned affirmative action. Or put another way, it banned the ability of governments all over the state of California to consider race or gender. It was, I would say, I think a lot of voters thought on its face it sort of made sense, but the reality, as we know now, is race matters, gender matters, and given, for example, women only make 80 cents on the dollar for men, given the structural racism conversations that we're having these days in law enforcement, et cetera, I strongly believe, as a former civil rights attorney, as well as many, many others, including Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom and labor and civil rights organizations, that we need to repeal Prop 209 to be able to finally reconsider the ability of looking at race or gender when it comes to public contracts, public education, and public hiring. So, for example, women-owned and minority-owned businesses have lost about $1 billion a year since Proposition 209. At this moment, we can't have programs to encourage the hiring of Black police officers or Latino doctors or Asian bilingual teachers, all kind of categories that we all wish there was a bit more diversity in. So that's Proposition 16, and hope folks will consider supporting that. Let's move to Proposition 17.
David, one question. Yeah. Do all these, are these all just require a simple majority? Or, I noticed with the local propositions, sometimes we need 2/3. Are all of these just a simple majority?
These are, no one's asked me that question. I believe, I'll think about it as we go through, but I believe almost all of them are simple majority measures. Okay. Proposition 17 would restore the right for individuals who have already done their time and they're out on parole to be able to vote. It would impact about 50,000 Californians. For a variety of reasons, I always support the expansion of voting rights, particularly for folks who have done their time, who we want to really inculcate back into the civic issues of the day when it comes to our community. During this moment of criminal justice reform, what we're trying to do as quickly as we can is bring folks who are transitioning from the criminal justice system to being as involved as we possibly can have them in our civic society. And I think that includes voting, which is why I'm supporting Proposition 17.
There's a question that came back, David, relating to Prop 16, and apologies, I should have gone slower with this. But there's a question about, hiring for bilingual. Is that prohibited by, I think, 209?
It's not prohibited by 209. It's a good question. It was prohibited by another ballot measure a few years later called Proposition 227, which actually banned bilingual education. That measure has actually been overturned, but maybe if I should be a little more precise, right now in let's say San Francisco, we don't have enough Chinese teachers who speak another language. We also, actually for that matter, in San Francisco, we don't have enough Chinese bilingual cops. Proposition 209 would allow us to consider race. So technically, it is separate from the issue of language ability, but obviously, most of our Chinese bilingual officers our officers bilingual in Chinese tend to be Chinese. So it would allow us to consider how we hire and the needs of community when it comes to diversity. That hopefully makes it clear. It's hard, I realize I can't actually see who's asking the question, so I'm providing answers and hoping it clarifies things, and I'll keep moving because we're only 3 or 4 into 12. Proposition 18, not to be confused with 17 and 18-year-olds, but this would allow a 70-year-old who will be 18 by the time of a general election to vote in the primary that is 6 months before. So that's the quick. Again, from my perspective, we want to ingrain in, say, high school students with the habit of voting, and particularly if they're going to have a chance to vote for, say, a presidential candidate on a general election day, We think that 6 months earlier, they should have a say in who California selects for our primary winner a few months before that. So that's the quick of Proposition 18. There's actually there's a local measure that would also expand voting by young people in San Francisco, which Aaron will talk about in 17 minutes.
Are those related at all, or is there a reason we're both seeing these two these two measures at the same time?
They're not related. One was a state measure. The other is a San Francisco measure. But this idea of expanding the vote to younger people is a movement, something I strongly support. What we have found is that by the time a kid is 18, typically, let's say they go to college, they're in transition, they have a lot of things in their lives, they're busy, they've moved. 18-year-olds don't vote. There's a saying in politics that 18-year-olds vote 18% of the time and 81-year-olds vote 81% of the time. Not exactly, but the trend is pretty much that. And so the idea is if a 16-year-old or 17-year-old could vote in high school, we're really inculcating that habit so it becomes a lifelong habit for people. All right, Proposition 19. I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of Proposition 19. It's very, very confusing. And so here's the quick. There are really three parts to Proposition 19, which was placed on the ballot by effectively the realtor industry. One part of this measure would increase the number of real estate transactions in a way that's going to cost the state money. A second part of the measure would reduce the ability for parents to provide an inheritance home to their child, to basically reduce the property tax break that they get in that instance. And the difference between what is spent and what is saved would be used for firefighters. So those are the three pieces of it. I'll dive a little bit more into it. On the first aspect, current law allows someone over the age of 55 to transfer their tax assessments, which means basically minimize the tax impact. If they sell the home they're in the county they're in, and move to a smaller home, and they can do this once without suffering kind of a typical property tax consequence. That's current law. What Proposition 19 would do, it would allow for individuals 55 years or older to do it multiple times, 3 times. It would allow them to move in different parts of the state, and it would allow them to transfer the tax benefit to a more expensive home. This is basically, from my perspective, the real estate industry's way of churning more transactions. Now, to pay for that, they are going to reduce the ability of parents that want to gift their home to their kids, and basically reduce the inheritance benefit that is provided to children today. That difference, if there is money that is saved from that, will go to wildfire agencies in California. But because we don't exactly know how often these things will be used, the estimated benefit for firefighters will, on the low end, it could be as little as in the tens of millions of dollars. It could be more than that, but we really don't know. From my perspective, the first part of this, which is the increase in the real estate transactions, is effectively expanding Proposition 13, which I think is absolutely the wrong direction to go. And in fact, the realtor industry put that issue alone on the ballot a few years ago, and it was panned. So that's why they're trying to do this complicated structure that I just mentioned. I just think it doesn't make sense, and not a fan of it. Prop 19. All right. Proposition 20 is a measure that would address prior state ballot measures that were progressive criminal justice reform measures. Or put another way, we had a couple of measures over the last couple of years, Proposition 47 and Proposition 57, which started to reduce criminal sentences for certain types of offenses. And there has been some sense from some conservatives in California and some members of law enforcement that the pendulum swung too far, and we need to re-add additional crimes to the list of violent felonies. We need to limit access to parole to certain individuals, and effectively, this is a bit of a law and order approach to the progressive criminal justice reform movement. I have been supportive of the progressive criminal justice reform movement. I think the law and order approach had a lot of consequences, including putting a lot of folks in jail, particularly young Black and brown men, for long periods of time, which were both extremely expensive as well as didn't impact our crime rates. So I'm not supportive of Proposition 20, and if folks want to know more, happy to dive into the details. Proposition 21 is on the topic of tenants and rent control. So Proposition 21 would impact a current state law known as Costa-Hawkins and would allow a city like San Francisco to consider expanding rent control basically in three ways. One, in San Francisco, rent control only applies to buildings that were built before 1979, older housing stock. Proposition 21 would allow, say, Aaron Peskin of the Board of Supervisors to consider expanding rent control to buildings built before 2005. 15 buildings that are 15 years and older would come under rent control if a local government decides. So that's change number one. Change number two is right now rent control does not apply to single family homes. And Proposition 21 would expand the ability of the Board of Supervisors to consider whether rent control should apply to, say, single-family homes unless the single-family homeowner owned two or less. So put another way, it would allow us to apply rent control to single-family homes owned by essentially professional property owners. And then the third thing it would allow for adjustments to rent control to apply in the circumstance when a unit becomes vacant. So, for example, if Nick is a renter, I don't know, actually, Nick, are you a renter?
I am.
So if Nick is a renter and he moves and his rent is currently at $3,000, under current law, the landlord can adjust that rent to whatever he or she wants. What Proposition 21, it would allow, again, a city like San Francisco to say to that landlord, you can raise your rent, but you can't raise it for more than you can't raise it more than 15% over a 3-year period. So it's known as it's a level of what's known as vacancy control of how rent changes when a unit is vacated. But bottom line, and this is a measure I support, this would expand the ability of local governments to fine-tune rent control laws, and I think that cities should get that freedom. There are only about 20 cities in California at this moment that have rent control, and that includes San Francisco. So I don't see this wildly changing rent control laws up and down the state, but it would allow San Francisco to have a little bit more ability to adjust our rent control policies.
All right. There's one question that we have from Barbara B. You might be able to see it here in the chat, but
I can't see this chat because I'm just literally trying to look at the numbers as we get through.
So I'll tell you. So when a tenant moves out, why is the landlord limited to a 15% increase in rent for the unit? Why can't the landlord ask for a market rate rent for that new tenant? You know, if there's been an old tenant, it's been in there for 20 years, the rent they would be paying would be, far lower than the market rate. So
it's a fair question. Here's what I would say. This is probably the biggest point of contention about this bill between the landlord world and the tenant world. Right now, the law is when a tenant vacates, the landlord can adjust to whatever the landlord wants, up to market rate. There's an argument for that. But oftentimes it creates sort of enormous pressures for a landlord to want to get rid of those tenants. So what this law does is it provides a rate of return, I think many would say a fair rate of return of 15% over 3 years, to say to that landlord, you can increase that rent, but you can't quadruple that rent. So that's sort of the debate here. From my perspective, it definitely was a push and pull, and I wish we could have negotiated this in the legislature, which is where I would have preferred it to go. But unfortunately, we have never been able to have much of a conversation about tweaks to Costa-Hawkins in the legislature, which is why the tenant community has gone to the ballot with this particular measure. All right. All right, Proposition 22, otherwise known as the ballot measure that Lyft and Uber are asking voters to consider. So there has been this very intense debate about whether drivers and other gig economy workers should be considered employees subject to the labor rights of minimum wage and healthcare and other sorts of benefits like that, or to be considered independent contractors, and if they're considered independent contractors, they would not receive those rights. Currently, say Lyft and Uber drivers are considered independent contractors, which suggests that they have freedom when it comes to what they do. The California Supreme Court a number of years ago came down with a ruling that effectively said gig economy workers are employees, and the legislature, including myself, passed, I supported a law called 85, which effectively categorizes, say, Lyft and Uber drivers and others as employees. And with that, it means that they will receive the benefits and the minimum benefits that other workers get. So Uber and Lyft were not excited about this. They placed Proposition 22 on the ballot to suggest effectively that rideshare drivers would be independent contractors, and they define in Proposition 22 how those workers would be paid and taxed. I am not supporting Proposition 22. I think that we should treat these drivers and gig economy workers as employees, subject to the rights that employees are supposed to get. But this one is probably the most expensive ballot measure on the ballot at this time, and you're probably likely seeing a lot of ads on it.
One question, and I'm realizing, again, we're a bit tight on time, so this is difficult, but I want to go back. There was a question, I think, here. I believe this was relating to it. It's by Schaefer. When you say you haven't been able to have these conversations in the legislature, I think this was about repealing Costa-Hawkins. Or for any given property, actually. Is that usually because the two sides are so far apart on their beliefs that those conversations never get off the ground, or is it something else?
I would say it's two things. It is that, right? So the tenant community and the landlord community are quite far apart on how to address this issue of Costa-Hawkins. But I would also say, as someone who co-authored a Costa-Hawkins reform bill a couple of years ago, Costa-Hawkins reform never gets out of the first committee because the landlord industry, from my perspective, has been unwilling to engage in a conversation, and they've killed every proposal in the very first committee. So so many bills go through multiple committees and multiple floor votes. I am actually the one legislator who's authored significant tenant bills in the legislature, really for the first time in years. And to get them through, you typically need to go through at least 6 committee votes and 3 floor votes. The Costa-Hawkins proposals never even get out of the first vote. They get killed right at the start because the landlord industry has just not been interested in engaging in an in-depth conversation and negotiation over this. So from my perspective, like I've said to them, I really wish we could do it. There are ways for us to do it that might not be, say, Proposition 21, but I think reasonable ways to do it. That conversation has never really gotten off the ground in any reasonable way. Here we are now at the ballot.
Okay. And then one other question came in relating to this Prop 22. This is from John P. About AB5. It seems like that's causing some intended consequences. You know, wouldn't it be better to amend AB5 instead of, special interest, pumping in 180 mil, using these Yeah,
it's a great question. And in fact, just this year, we passed a major set of dozens of amendments to AB5. And I think that it is appropriate for the legislature to be that place where we're having these discussions. So the amendments that we passed this year had to do with how the definition of employees and independent contractors apply to a wide variety of industries. Because as you can imagine, Lyft and Uber drivers different from from soccer coaches, different from musicians that do gig work at, say, a local jazz club in North Beach, et cetera, et cetera. And so we actually passed an AB5, what was called an AB5 sort of cleanup bill that looked at dozens of different industries and sort of finely tuned definitions to different industries. I think that's the appropriate way for us to address some of these issues. I think and hope someday, if Proposition 22 doesn't pass, we may have a conversation around if Lyft and Uber drivers. But at this point, this is sort of an up or down. What are we going to do? Will all of these folks be exempted out of the current law that the California Supreme Court said ought to apply in this category? And I would say on that, no.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Proposition 23 is something that I also wish had been dealt with in the legislature. This involves the topic of kidney dialysis clinics. And this is not the first time this issue has been on the ballot. So the context is we have kidney dialysis clinics, a lot of them in the state of California. And the patients who are in them desperately need kidney dialysis. We have a number of companies that run these clinics that are making an awful lot of money. And the workers in those clinics and some of the patients in those clinics are not so happy with how these clinics are run. And so this ballot measure was put on the ballot by the workers in these clinics who want to have higher standards, both for healthcare standards, like requiring an on-site doctor to be present when patients are being treated, to require data around, say, dialysis-related infections in different clinics, et cetera, and also to require that patients not be treated differently depending on whether they have private insurance or whether their insurance is our Medi-Cal system, which is for low-income Californians. So the labor unions that would like to represent the workers in these clinics have placed Proposition 23 in the ballot to essentially require these clinics to abide by more rules that would provide more protections around health and safety standards in the clinics. It is being opposed by, as you can imagine, the management of those companies that have been making quite a bit of money over the years. And this is the fight. I had hoped that this was not going to go to the ballot and it was going to be resolved in the legislature, but alas, here we are. I am supporting Proposition 23. So I am on the side of the workers and the consumers and the patients. A no vote is on the side of the clinic corporate managers, and in particular, the DaVita and Fresenius companies that run a large portion of these dialysis clinics in California. And I see I have literally 1 minute left before Aaron shows up. All right, Proposition 24. This also involves a big, hairy topic that I wish we sort of could deal with in the legislature, but because of issues I'm going to explain, I do think rightfully should be supported at the ballot. It deals with the topic of consumer privacy, particularly in a context when we're all providing lots of information about ourselves online. So for many years, there was no movement in Sacramento around privacy, or put another way, it didn't seem as if anyone cared about consumer privacy. So along came a San Franciscan named Alistair McTaggart, who was pretty passionate about this stuff. And because our legislature, we were unable to pass real privacy laws, he threatened to put on the ballot a measure 2 years ago to protect consumer privacy. By the threat of him doing that, we actually passed our first major consumer privacy law last year. That's a good thing, something I strongly supported. Now, it turned out, though, in the last couple months, there have been many attempts to basically water down that consumer privacy bill. So Alistair, being very concerned, and many privacy advocates being very concerned that what we did at the ballot, or what we did in the legislature is about to be watered down, he has proposed Proposition 24 to effectively expand consumer privacy and also tighten enforcement of these privacy laws. So Proposition 24 would basically expand consumer data privacy. So it would allow consumers to tell businesses, don't share my personal information. It creates a privacy agency to enforce these laws. And it basically doesn't give businesses a free ride. Right now, under our state law, businesses can fix violations before being penalized, what Proposition 24 would say is no. You don't get a get out of jail free card. You have to protect consumer privacy. So in other words, under current law, companies can violate the privacy laws, and if someone catches them, they say, "Oh, sorry, my bad, I'll fix it." Under Proposition 24, it says to those businesses, "No, you don't get a free ride. You've got to deal with it up front." So I am supporting doing this. One question that keeps coming up is, doesn't this remove from the legislature our ability to protect privacy? And it doesn't. There's a measure in Proposition 24 that says that the legislature can increase privacy protections, and we are fully within our right to do it, but we can't undercut the consumer privacy protections that are in Proposition 24. So it effectively lays out a floor, but not a ceiling. The other thing it does for folks who are interested, at this moment, Europe has a decent privacy standard for the entire European continent. The United States has not followed the GDPR standards that were established in Europe. This law would, for the first time, create a standard for an American state that happens to be the 5th largest economy in the world, and that is the state of California, to play by the same privacy protections as Europe, which hopefully will start to influence the rest of the country. So I am supportive of Proposition 24. That's the quick. And it is 6:03. Any burning questions, Nick?
One question is, was that proposition written with input from social media companies? Because I remember reading the no side, and that was something that was being presented, that social media companies had an impact on this. Is there any truth to that?
So here's what I would say is Alistair is a privacy advocate, and tech companies and the social media companies, they were attacking him mercilessly for what he did. In the last year, since our state privacy measure was put, they approached him with lots and lots of questions. And I think it's fair to say he tried to hit this law. It's reasonable, but I can tell you that the tech industry would prefer for this not to pass. Generally, this law basically creates a state agency to go after companies that are not abiding by it. And that's not something, creating a watchdog agency is not something that industry is wild about. So I think it's fair to say he spoke to everyone involved, both privacy advocates as well as industry. This is his best attempt to tighten up our privacy laws. I think he did a good job of that, which is why I'm supporting.
Okay. Oh, actually, one really quickly. Why, from Schaefer? Why do you think big corporate money market? Why isn't big corporate money marketing or fighting against Prop 24?
It's a good question. I think it's because 70% of the public supports tightening consumer privacy, and big tech companies are dumping their money into the Lyft Uber fight, where they've dumped like over $100 million.
Yeah.
And I could say this ballot, I want to say there's something like $650 million that are being pumped into a whole variety of these measures. So, for example, the Prop 15, which would amend Prop 13, huge money fight. The bail reform fight is a huge money fight. And Proposition 16 is becoming, on affirmative action, is becoming there's more money that's going in that to educate voters on what that's about. So there's just a lot of resources that are going into this election. All right. Anything else?
That's it. I think last but not least, is it Prop 25?
Oh, sorry. I didn't even talk about Prop. Sorry, I thought I was at the end. Proposition 25. So 2 years ago, Governor Brown signed a bill that I co-authored to end the money bail system in California. So let me explain the system we have now. Basically, we have a system that if you are poor, if you don't have resources, and you have been arrested for a crime, you sit in jail awaiting your trial. But if you're rich, if you're Donald Trump, you can bail your way out of whatever offenses you have. In a different way. We have a system that effectively jails people and treats them as if they're guilty until they have proven themselves innocent, if they're poor. But if you're wealthy, you can just kind of hang out and do whatever you want because you've been able to bail out. The money bail system, as you can imagine, has had an enormous impact on sort of the topic of justice and keeping Black and brown folks jailed awaiting trial, which, as you can imagine, puts more pressure on low-income folks to plea out and plead guilty to a crime, even if they may not be guilty of a crime, just so they can get out and get on with their lives. We passed a law in 2018, SB 10, which would replace the current money bail system with a system that assesses whether someone is a risk to society. In other words, are you a public safety risk? So that's what we want to replace it with. That was SB 10. And by and large, as you can imagine, the very profitable bail industry is funding an awful lot of resources to overturn SB 10. So to be clear, a yes vote for Proposition 25, that's the side I support. It would uphold the state law that we passed, which would replace the money cash bail system with this risk assessment system. So that's the quick. Any other questions?
No, I think we are good. Wow, yeah, listen, yeah, Assemblymember Chiu, just on behalf of everyone attending and the Telegraph Hill dwellers, thank you so much for joining us. I know, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say I think these measures, are overwhelming for so many folks. I find it a little crazy sometimes that the public's got to be so educated on all these topics. I also find it beautiful at the same time in our democracy. But this was really, really insightful. And yeah, thank you so much.
Of course, and again, I hope everyone is well, and hope to see people in the neighborhood sometime soon in Washington Square Park or at an event on Telegraph Hill or North Beach sometime soon. So everyone be well, and now I am honored to bring in my predecessor and successor, Supervisor Peskin. How are you?
I am well, David. How are you doing?
I'm good. Now you get to do your speed dating session with your 13 measures.
Well, I only have 12, and you had 12, and then there's one regional measure, which would be 13.
Right, which we are both supporting. Measure RR, support Caltrain.
Yes, now that we've got a deal.
Yep, right on.
Thank you for your help on that.
Right on. I will see you soon, Aaron. Nick, thank you, and be well, everyone.
See you. All right. Well, on that note, I would like to introduce Supervisor Aaron Peskin, who has joined us. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. I hope I've pressed all the right buttons and you can see me and hear me. Is that true?
I don't think your video is coming through. The video is the one thing.
Okay, what button should I press to do that?
There should be at towards the top. You should see a little, sort of like an old school video camera. It's to the right of the microphone button, and if you click on that,
I see a thing that says, yes, got it.
I think camera.
Hello, Nick.
Hello. Joys of modern technology here.
It's working?
It's working great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Ferris, for organizing this, and thank you to my predecessor, both at this moment, and my predecessor as Supervisor, David Chiu, and thank you to the Telegraph Hill dwellers. This is actually something that David and I have done for many years for the Barbary Coast neighbors, usually in person, but this year we did it virtually, and it's really always been a pleasure to get together with folks who want to learn about what's on the ballot by people who, in some cases, help put it on the ballot, and that's probably a good segue into the way I start conversations about the local ballot. In the state of California in the 1800s, when the railroads had taken over every aspect of elected government, when there was a revolution against that, it ended up with the Citizens Voter Initiative process. So voters can actually put things directly on the ballot. In the early 1900s, when there was a huge corruption scandal at City Hall that made the Muhammad Nuru stuff seem like child's play. The charter of San Francisco was amended in the year 1932 to actually allow 4 members of the board to go directly to the electorate, the court of last resort. We have a charter that is basically our Constitution, and only the voters can change that. And there are 2 ways that that can appear on the ballot. A majority of the elected body, the Board of Supervisors, 11 members, so 6 of them can put that before the voters, or the voters can put that before themselves. And any tax measure under state law requires approval by the voters. So the reason I tell you that is I think it's really important as to why are these things on the ballot and do they need to be on the ballot, because the reason that we all elect supervisors and mayors is mostly so they can do their job under that dome in that beautiful building that we call City Hall. So I always start by saying that, and with each and every one of these measures, I will speak to that. The first measure on this ballot, Proposition A, is indeed a tax measure insofar as it is a general obligation bond issuance, which means that this would affect property taxes, which can affect both property owners and tenants, because property owners can pass through under our laws 50% of any increase of their property taxes to their tenants. Having said that, interestingly enough, many, many years ago, we actually came up with a Solomonic piece of policy in San Francisco, wherein San Francisco has issued as much debt as it retires. So we all know that we have many, many bonds out there that voters have approved for everything from building new fire stations to building new parks to paving our streets. And when the voters vote for a bond like this one, $487.5 million, we don't sell all of those bonds at once. Once the city gets that voter approval, we sell them in tranches. And for the last decade and a half, we have only sold as much as we've retired an equivalent amount of debt. So interestingly enough, the controller's statement in the ballot handbook, this big thick book that you all have, is true and correct, which is it will not raise anybody's marginal tax rate, nor can any property owner like myself pass through anything to their tenants because there is no actual increase in the marginal tax rate. Having said that, I, by way of full disclosure, want to acknowledge the fact that your property taxes can go up under Proposition 13 by no more than 2% a year under a formula. So your taxes could go up a little bit, but it is not a function of this or any other general obligation bond measure. This particular measure was long contemplated as a recreation and parks bond, but during COVID, the mayor and the board worked together to actually expand that to be both a health and homelessness, parks, and economic recovery bond. Of that $487 million, $239 million would be spent for parks and open space. $207 million would be spent on the acquisition and rehabilitation of mental health and homeless facilities throughout the city and county of San Francisco, an additional $41.5 million on improving our streets and public plazas, for a total of $487 million. It was put on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors with a unanimous vote and is supported by the mayor. It is truly, of all the measures on the ballot, a consensus measure, and it requires a 2/3, as Nick has put forward on the screen. And Nick, I just bumped into your other half as I was walking over here. So it requires 66 and 2/3 plus one vote, and I commend it to you. I do have to say selfishly that It does include a very large chunk of money, $54 million for the renovation of Portsmouth Square, which is long overdue and has been the subject of a phenomenally collaborative community planning process. And this would be the capital to redo one of San Francisco's 3 original parks that needs a little bit of love and tender care. So that's Proposition A. Should I go on to Proposition B, or I'm not sure what the format is, Nick, and if you have questions or how that works.
People are adding questions as they come, but I think Proposition A was good. Yeah, let's jump to B, please.
I'm sorry, Nick?
Yeah, let's jump to B.
Okay.
No questions so far.
So Proposition B is a charter amendment, which means that only the voters can change our Constitution, if you will. And as I said, a majority of the board can place that on the ballot. 7 of the 4 supervisors did that. It requires a simple majority of the electorate to approve. Proposition B basically does 2 things. And I refer to former disgraced, and I have to say as a city official, I am embarrassed by what happened. Mohammed Nuru, who ran the Department of Public Works. The Department of Public Works, unlike virtually any other department in city government, has for 150 years had no oversight body, no commission, no transparency. Their contracts don't go before a place where, like the Department of Public Health or the Human Services Agency, people can comment, spurn bidders, can protest. DPW has been that way for 150 years. Most importantly, Proposition B would put a public citizens oversight commission over what we used to know as Public Works. But it also splits Public Works into 2 departments. One, the Department of Sanitation and Streets, and the other, Public Works. And for those of you who do not know, Public Works has a plethora of things underneath it, ranging from maintaining city-owned buildings to repaving our streets to the county surveyor who does all of the surveying and plat maps and subdivisions for the city, to our Bureau of Urban Forestry, and quite frankly, and you know this and I know this, the thing that is near and dear to all of us, which is having clean streets, has been left behind. So this actually splits the department into 2 departments, creates 2 oversight commissions over both of them. I commend it to you. I think it will finally give sanitation and clean streets the attention and focus that they have long deserved in San Francisco, as well as get rid of the culture of coziness and corruption by having that level of citizen oversight with a commission over both bodies. And I'm happy to answer questions about that. And I know that we are now 22 minutes after 6, and I've still got 11 more to go.
One question, Supervisor Peskin. I get this bill. This is killing 2 birds with 1 stone here. Is there one part that's more significant than the other? Is it the new department or oversight? And battling corruption. Is there one more important piece of this legislation? Do you think?
Thanks, Nick, for that question. I would actually say that the oversight is more important than the splitting of the department, because even with the oversight, people could go down there and be pissed off and talk about toilet contracts and talk about street sweeping contracts. So I think the oversight is long overdue. Interestingly enough, my then colleague, Jake McGoldrick, attempted to do this many, many years ago. I agreed with him, but in those days, and interestingly enough, the head of the Department of Public Works in those days was, God rest his soul, Ed Lee. Ed was able to get 6 votes to stop Jake and I from putting that on the ballot. So there's a little bit of history for you.
All right. And just a quick plug, a reminder, anyone who just joined, if you have any questions, please put them in the right-hand side, the chat bar, and we'll ask them after each proposition.
So should we move on to Prop C, Nick?
Yeah, looks like we're good.
So Prop C is also a charter amendment, which again is a change to our kind of sort of constitution, which would allow non-citizens to serve on boards and commissions and advisory bodies. I fundamentally believe that having everybody in our society have access to the levers of government and encouraging that diversity makes us stronger. In this particular case, my staff member, Sarah Souza, who is a DACA recipient and an immigrant rights leader, was somebody who actually educated me on this and explained to me why it was so important to bring non-citizens into the public process. The Democratic Party recently did this and allowed non-citizens to serve on local Democratic parties in the state of California. And she actually changed my thinking about this, and I am proud to support it. It was put on the ballot by all 11 members of the Board of Supervisors, and I'm happy to answer questions about that.
The audience is going quiet here. No questions. You're doing a great job here.
Well, don't worry. It'll get worse. I'll move on to Prop D. And let me just say that we are in the middle of what will be probably the largest economic downturn, not since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, but since the Great Depression when my father was a little kid. And so I have always been very reluctant in tough economic times and even in good economic times to add city costs. Proposition D is also a charter amendment that would create oversight over the Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department is another outlier, in many ways very similar to the Department of Public Works, but a little bit different because the 58 sheriffs of the 58 counties of California are independently elected, and generally the rule of the road is that independently elected officials like myself are accountable to the voters. But we've had a number of really quite troubling things that have happened at the Sheriff's Department. I think you are probably all aware and read with the same horror the gladiator fights that happened in the county jail. My colleague, Supervisor Sherman Walton, came up with this concept of a modicum of oversight that does cost a little bit of money. If you give me a second, I can tell you what the controller says it will cost, which is a minimum of $400,000 and a maximum of $2.5 million, which is what gave me a little bit of pause. But this will basically create an oversight board and an inspector general to investigate complaints of misconduct by employees of the Sheriff's Department. And it's really one piece of a larger effort to implement reasonable law enforcement reforms in San Francisco. The next measure is also a charter amendment that does the same thing. And I'm happy to answer any questions about Proposition D, but I commend it to you.
There was one, I'm not sure what proposition this was in relation to, but John P. was asking, what was your original concern before changing your mind?
Oh, no. My original concern was merely a fiscal concern, which is that in each and every one of these things, in the middle of a pandemic where the city's revenue is falling, that I not add city financial burdens. So I always analyze every single measure through that lens. And as I said, the controller, and it's really one of the things I always read is the controller's statement on each and every measure. And if you look at this, the controller sets out what the estimated annual cost of this measure would be. In this case, the maximum is $2.5 million for creating this oversight function in government. So that was, I was never opposed to it. That was one of the things that I was concerned about. And it's one of the reasons that I actually worked with Supervisor Walton to pare down his original vision to make it less expensive.
Yeah, and there's another question that we have from John. Who does the investigations of the sheriff misconduct now?
It's all internal to the department. So the department actually very, very recently, arguably in an attempt to head this charter amendment off, actually entered into a contract with the Department of Police Accountability, wherein they shipped a little bit of money over to the Department of Police Accountability. So let me take a step back, Nick. Historically, the police department had a unit within it called Internal Affairs that investigated wrongdoing or alleged wrongdoing within the police department. Later on, that became the Office of Citizen Complaints. Later on, the voters voted to create the Department of Police Accountability. And very recently, the Sheriff's Department actually entered into a contract with the Department of Police Accountability to investigate allegations of wrongdoing within their department. This really codifies that and makes it a part of the charter and makes it a part of our day-to-day law, not an MOU between two departments, and requires us to do this now and forever.
All right.
So if there are no other questions, let me move on to Prop E, and I'll try to go as fast as possible. And I really appreciate everybody who's spending their evening learning about these things. And the best thing to do is I would say, follow the money and figure out who's spending a lot of money to support or oppose something. And that's usually the side that you don't want to be on. But at any rate, Proposition E is another, I think, extremely reasonable law enforcement reform that was also unanimously supported by the Board of Supervisors. And when I say unanimously supported, there's actually a pretty large diversity of opinion and ideology and political views on the Board of Supervisors. So don't take it lightly when we say unanimously. I mean, my friend and colleague from District 2, Catherine Stephanie, is a former district attorney, and when she votes for things like this and puts them before the voters and supports them and affixes her name to that, I think that says a lot. And this too is a charter amendment, which would remove the totally arbitrary minimum police staffing requirement and requires the police department to submit a report recommending police staffing levels based on absolutely independent, scientific, as much as you can do that, informed by a needs-based data assessment to the police commission and ultimately the Board of Supervisors as we formulate the budget every year. And I say that in a period of time when we are fundamentally rethinking policing, not only in San Francisco, but in urban America, and coming to the conclusion that the best person to send to somebody who is in psychological or behavioral health distress isn't necessarily a police officer if there isn't a violent situation, but a mental health professional. And that de-escalating things is the right thing to do. Many years ago, and this literally happened, or so the story goes, and I actually know the players who were involved, and they're all still alive. On the back of a napkin, former Supervisor Anne Marie Conroy, the last elected Republican to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, political consultant Jack Davis, and the one who is not alive, Warren Hinkle, came up with the arbitrary number of 1,971 full sworn duty officers for the SFPD. So we've got cops who work in the records room. We've got cops who are doing computer work at the department. These are things that should be done by civilians who work for the department, arguably for less money, but we have been hamstrung by this arbitrary number that was approved by the voters. This would reform that. It is supported by all 11 members of the Board of Supervisors. I commend it to you, and happy to answer any questions.
No questions. Let's see. Oh, wait, there's one question. From Mark Bruno. Where is the HOT team in your suggestion that mental health workers might be sent to someone in psychological stress? Does the HOT team still exist? Could you explain what they do, please? Sure.
So through Mr. Ferris to Mr. Bruno, HOT stands for Homeless Outreach Team. This is a number of courageous, smart, lovely folks under the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing that you may see on the streets. They don't wear any special uniforms. They are first-line responders to homeless people in San Francisco. It is a remarkably important function in government. It has not been well enough funded. And I think that is a really, really good segue, if you will let me, into Proposition F, which is a restructuring of San Francisco's business tax regulations. And Proposition F, just so that you know, is near and dear to me insofar as I have many hundreds of hours into this. And this was actually something that was contemplated for many, many years, and not by way of telling you John Steinbeck style, the life of the chicken before we put it on the table. San Francisco's business tax regulations actually started under a very radical left-wing elected official named Dianne Feinstein. Sorry, that was tongue-in-cheek. And Los Angeles subsequently adopted a very similar set of business tax regulations. In the late 1990s, Los Angeles and San Francisco were sued by 52 national and multinational corporations over a business tax model that we'd had for many decades. That model was a grader of gross receipts or payroll model. Subsequently, and this is right when I first got elected 20 years ago, we were left with no choice than to get rid of the gross receipts tax, a tax based on gross receipts that a company gets, and go to a payroll-only tax. Everybody agreed at that time that a payroll tax was had a downward impact on job growth in San Francisco, and we sought to move to a gross receipts only. My predecessor, David Chiu, in the year 2012, came up with a new model that went before the voters, that the voters approved, that became effective in 2014, and it has been in place for a little more than a half a decade. And this was a project that we were all working on with the controller, the mayor's office, the board of supervisors, various businesses, different interest groups, our city economists, and then COVID hit. So this does a number of things. And I think most importantly, before I get to what Mark was talking about, is that it gives a huge amount of relief to small businesses. It doubles the exemption for small businesses from $1 million to $2 million annually, as well as right-sizing the top tax tiers to ensure that those corporations making the most pay their fair share. The folks who actually did very well under the 2012 scheme and have done very well during COVID-19 have been big tech, and this would make them pay their fair share to support essential public services and infrastructure, including the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, which gets us to the HOT team, while offering sorely needed relief to small businesses and cost-sensitive industries. So that includes the hotel industry, the restaurant industry, wholesaling. And in addition to that, it would unlock millions of dollars from two other tax revenue measures that the voters approved for affordable childcare and homeless services, both of which were the subject of litigation, one of which the state Supreme Court recently ruled against the large businesses and anti-tax folks, and that actually unlocked a lot of money for homeless and affordable housing subsidies, 3 weeks ago. But this would unlock many more millions of dollars for affordable childcare. And as I said, I personally devoted hundreds of hours to this measure. It too was put before the voters by a unanimous vote of the Board of Supervisors, and like Proposition A, is unanimously supported not only by the 11 of us, but by Mayor Breed, and would fund everything from muni transit to street cleaning and workforce development and homeless outreach and services.
So we've got one question on this from John. John P. Oops, where did it go? Yeah, so there was, regarding Prop F, there was a big change in the San Francisco business tax structure a few years ago. Not sure if that's finished rolling out, but do you have are there any concerns about added complexity, frequent moving of the goalpost on business taxes, or will this simplify things?
So the number of business tax schedules was actually vastly consolidated in 2012. This does not expand the number of business tax schedules, which I believe are 6 business tax schedules. So the complexity is the same. The other thing I should add and fail to add is that this would finally repeal the last bit of the payroll tax and go to a gross receipts tax only system. So for whatever that's worth, and I can actually delve down into the tax policy of that if people are interested, but it gets rid of the last of the payroll tax.
Okay, I think we can move on.
So Proposition G, which, by the way, you heard from David Chiu earlier. I missed his thing earlier this evening, but I heard him the other day at the Barbary Coast Neighbors. And this is very similar to a measure on the state ballot. This, too, is a charter change. So, again, it needs to go before the voters. And it would authorize young people ages 16 and 17 to vote in municipal elections, and was on the ballot before in 2016. And I have to say that going into 2016, when this went before the Board of Supervisors, I initially was opposed to it. This sometimes happens. I actually changed my mind after my former youth commissioner presented me with compelling academic research, published research, and arguments at a joint session of the board, wherein she actually showed me that voting is a learned behavior. And for people who want to avail themselves, as I did at the age of 18, you become a lifelong voter. And for those youths who are young and excited and interested in the process at age 16 and 17 before they maybe get alienated, if they start voting, they will continue to vote. These are smart and engaged people, and ultimately I came to support that measure in 2016, which narrowly lost at the polls, and I am supporting it and taking another crack at it today, and I commend it to you. It too was put on the ballot by an 11-0 vote, and is a charter amendment, so it requires 50% plus 1 vote.
All right. The one I think a lot of folks have been waiting for.
Proposition H. Is that the one you're talking about?
That is, absolutely.
So let me, this is actually a good, let me start with this, which is, as we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, there are certain things that can be done via the ballot, or have to be done via the ballot, amending the charter, levying a tax. This measure didn't have to be on the ballot. This is something that, and just to get down into the 1932 charter, the mayor can put an ordinance on the ballot with 1 signature. And that is the case here. And it was not done with any deliberation with the legislative branch, and it could be done legislatively. And there are many very good concepts in this measure. And if you look at this book and you go to the end of it, it is actually 24 pages of really, really small type. That is usually the stuff that we do at committee hearings where people come in and say, wait a minute, did you really mean to do this to section 831.7 of the code? And you go, whew, thanks for pointing that out. We'll fix that. And by the way, when you learn that you made some mistakes or that things weren't working, you can go back in and fix it. So while there are many very good concepts in this, there are also some other problems insofar as it creates some one-size-fits-all ballot box planning, including removing community input from areas including Chinatown and the Mission, gets rid of neighborhood notice, but it also, in a time of a pandemic, is going to streamline things. And it does have a provision that ultimately is what brought me around, which is in 3 years, the Board of Supervisors can make any tweaks to it. So given the pandemic and given that provision, I can live with it.
There's one question from Mark regarding, could it be effective without attempting to rewrite part of the planning code as it currently does? You know, could retailers benefit from fast track permits without opening up new areas of the city to restaurants and bars, which Prop H does?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Mark. Look, let's be clear. I got a email from a neighborhood architect who we all know about a case that has nothing to do with District 3, wherein he sent me some paperwork saying that he had applied for a building permit and could not get a appointment at the building inspection department until February over a relatively pedestrian project. And where the rubber hits the road is over delays in the bureaucracy at the Department of Building Inspection. And so I think that's really where we have to concentrate our efforts. Having said that, look, there are so many projects that I think neighborhoods embrace or do not oppose that should move through the system much quicker. And that is why I actually authored and passed what we cutely call the CU Sooner legislation, the conditional use sooner legislation, that has vastly sped up the conditional use infrastructure process in San Francisco. But look, during the pandemic, our job is to repopulate as many of these vacant storefronts that were under tremendous pressure even before the pandemic. And having said that, whatever you all decide on any of these measures, I appreciate.
Okay. If we move right on along.
So Prop I, if your mailbox looks like my mailbox, is getting a huge amount of opposition from real estate investment trusts and the largest downtown landowners in San Francisco. This measure would increase the real estate transfer tax on property sales between over $10 million, actually between $10 and $25 million to 5.5%, and on sales over $25 million to 6%. This is a tax that is paid one time on the sale of real property, which is a extremely volatile tax because there are years where because of a recession or various market factors, there are very few sales of large buildings. This affects almost no residential property in San Francisco other than if Park Merced sold or the Golden Gateway sold or a handful of mansions in Pacific Heights sold. The lead sponsor, Supervisor Preston, intends to use the proceeds to go towards citywide rent and mortgage relief in the aftermath of COVID-19. Are there any questions about Prop I?
None.
And again, I would say follow the money. Proposition J is, this is another John Steinbeck, got to tell you about the life of the chicken before we dinner story. So many years ago, the anti-tax forces of California, commonly known as the Jarvis-Gann taxpayers, put forward a statewide constitutional amendment, Proposition 218, that said that any dedicated tax that was passed by a local government in the state of California required a 2/3 vote, which made it very, very hard in virtually every city and county in the state of California to pass dedicated tax measures. Subsequently, there was a very interesting lawsuit that was adjudicated by the California State Supreme Court called the Uplands decision, wherein the Supreme Court indicated that Prop 218 only applied to taxes that the government put on the ballot, like what we just talked about, Proposition I, which, by the way, I neglected to say that Proposition I was not put on by the full Board of Supervisors, but you saw that on your screen. It was actually put on by 4 supervisors. So the Uplands decision said that measures that were put on by the voters only required 50% plus 1. As a result of that, our city attorney, Dennis Herrera, issued a public opinion and said to the Department of Elections that any tax that was put on the ballot by the voters, by voter initiative, by signature, only required 50% plus 1. Proposition J was a tax measure that was put on by the voters in 2018, which was a $320 per parcel tax to fund living wages for our public school teachers. It was Proposition G. And the Jarvis-Gann folks sued the city of San Francisco, actually sued the San Francisco Unified School District. And Proposition J is an attempt, if you will, to get around that. That litigation is ongoing. It will eventually be resolved. It will probably go all the way to the California State Supreme Court. It will probably take a couple of more years. And this measure would repeal Proposition G and replace it with a slightly lesser tax of $288 per parcel for teacher wages, and would get rid of that litigation and would still fund our teachers. So that is what Proposition J is. Does that, I'm sorry if that all did not make a lick of sense.
One question that I had on this was why, I didn't quite understand, you may have hit this, like, why is it not available exactly? You know, we had this previous tax, it was raise more money, it's locked up in the courts.
So the answer is, it got more than 50%, but less than 2/3. And then the Unified School District and the city, because the city actually, under the measure, collects the tax and remits it to the school district, were sued under the theory that it requires 2/3 of the electorate because it was a dedicated tax, regardless of the fact that the Uplands decision said that a voter initiative was not subject to a 2/3 vote. So this is a unclear area of law, although it just became a lot clearer when the Supreme Court, there were 3 cases that are very similar. Proposition C, which I referenced earlier, which was the money for homelessness, that did make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the city won. But the smaller, the next year's little Prop C, or baby Prop C as we fondly call it, is still in the courts, and Proposition G is still in the courts. But the Unified School District would like to be able to release this money for teacher wages. And just so that we're clear, The city is collecting this money, but is not remitting this money until the litigation is resolved. Because if the litigation goes against the city, we do not want to have spent the money. And because we are fiscally prudent and have the best tax rating or bond rating of any city in America, we are being prudent in not releasing the money. Proposition J would resolve that problem.
Got it. Thanks for that detail. John Stamps had some questions on that. Your detail answered that. All right. Prop K.
Prop K is a weird thing. And I say, as somebody who has worked on any number of affordable housing projects in San Francisco, look at Broadway and Battery, which was the first one that I had a big hand in after the Loma Prieta earthquake, after we ripped down the Embarcadero Freeway, after then State Senator Quentin Kopp was able to pass legislation to return the former on-ramps and off-ramps to the city and county of San Francisco. That was the on-ramp. Let's see if my brain goes back that far. Was at Sansom and Broadway. The off-ramp was at Broadway and Battery. The elevated freeway went over Broadway and Davis. There was another on-ramp at Washington and Drum. So we ended up with 4 parcels of land in San Francisco. And interestingly enough, the city could not own and develop, well, we could own, but we could not develop affordable housing on those projects because of a bizarre 1950s era redlining provision, Article 34 of the California State Constitution, that actually requires municipalities to have a local election in order to allow their own city to develop and construct affordable housing. And so this it is the first time that San Francisco has contemplated this in almost 70 years. And it would allow us to actually do our own projects rather than doing what we did at Broadway and Battery and Broadway and Sansom, and now Broadway and Davis, which is to have to contract this out to nonprofit affordable housing developers.
So Jonathan B. has a question on this. Will Prop K help organizations like the SF Community Land Trust to buy land to create resident-owned and controlled housing, like Columbus United Cooperative? And how can we prevent municipally owned social housing falling into disrepair, like Midtown Park, with the city working against the wishes of tenants to have rent control or own their own homes?
Yeah, Jonathan B., that is a really, really good question. And I'll say the converse of that, which is, that you have cities like Vienna, Austria, that actually own virtually all of the affordable housing stock in Vienna. We here have nonprofits that own, manage, and develop most of our affordable housing stock. And the interesting thing is, some of them do great, some of them do terrible, some of them do great in some eras and less great in other eras, and then the city has to go after them. But I hear you, the city can do a bad job as well. And the interesting thing about Midtown, if anybody knows that development, which is actually predates the Article 34 of the California Constitution, that is a city-owned affordable housing project where the city actually did any number of things, and ultimately the residents of that project held the city accountable, and we turned that around because we actually were accountable to our constituents. So I don't think there's any right answer here, Jonathan, but if Prop K passes, it will really allow the beginning of a conversation relative to city development and ownership of affordable rental units in San Francisco.
And there's 2 other questions.
And by the way, just Nick, not to interrupt you, but it doesn't come with any money. So the answer to Jonathan's question is, this will not help the Community Land Trust acquire land. It will not help San Francisco acquire land. It would merely create that opportunity.
Okay. And there are two other questions. One from John P. You know, are there any residency requirements for city-owned affordable housing? You know, it's coming from saying that, you know, if such housing is open to the entire world, well, it's unfair and unsustainable.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating area of public policy, and you will actually see that that has evolved over a number of years, and there are actually a set of preferences. We were actually sued by the United States government, claiming that we might have violated the Fair Housing Act. We ultimately survived that challenge, but we actually have a number of preferences that start with San Franciscans who have been displaced, and those come in a number of different tranches, ranging from people who were historically displaced out of the A1 and A2. That was Justin Herman era redevelopment in the Western Addition and other parts of the city, and those individuals can actually get preference in lotteries. We have a preference for people who have been Ellis acted and are otherwise the subject of no-fault evictions. So there are actually a series of preferences, and the way when affordable housing becomes available, if you meet one of those preferences, you have first dibs. And yes, those preferences start with local people, or people who were local before they were displaced.
And then from Carol Verberg, if Prop K passes, would DPW control or heavily influence where the money and contracts go?
No. The answer to that is no, because DPW has never had anything to do with that as a matter of law. The Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development has always been the central function of that in our government.
Okay. Onwards and forward.
That gets we're down to two. That gets us to the CEO tax, and this measure, which is actually copying off of something that Portland did, imposes an additional tax on companies whose highest paid managerial employee makes more than 100 times the median employee salary amongst their San Francisco employees. And unlike Proposition F, this is an extremely volatile tax with a pretty narrow taxpayer base. That being said, the controller estimates it could bring in anywhere from $60 to upwards of $100 million for general fund obligations, including Mental Health San Francisco, as intended by the chief sponsor, Supervisor Haney. And has, not surprisingly, brought the wrath of some of our largest headquartered companies like Lyft and Uber and others. And I guess I should also add that too was placed on the ballot unanimously and requires a majority vote +1 of the electorate.
One question from John P. Any concern the CEO tax would penalize companies with lower skilled workers, like retail, compared to big tech firms with highly skilled and paid workers?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, if you actually look at Ted Egan's analysis in the retail sector, whether you're talking about Macy's West or other companies, they actually don't have that kind of differential. That differential is actually much more in real estate investment trusts, and big tech. It really does not occur in the retail sector. And if you look at Proposition F also gives huge amounts of relief to the retail sector. So yeah, this is not the greatest thing since sliced bread. I support it, but I'm not worried about the retail sector as it relates to Prop L.
Okay. And I think we've done it here.
No, we've got one more.
Prop RR, yeah.
Prop RR, as in railroad. So this is not a San Francisco only measure. This is a regional measure that, for those of you who have never ridden that train that goes from Gilroy, California, 77 miles north through San Jose, up the peninsula, and terminates currently in the south of Market at 4th and King Street, called Caltrain, which pre-COVID moved about 65,000 people a day, took them off of the congested 101 corridor, and is in the process of being electrified, and has incredible growth potential. This is a regional sales tax measure, an admittedly regressive tax that would add 1/8 of a cent sales tax, generating about $100 million a year. That is going to appear on the ballots of Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Francisco County, and give Caltrain, for the first time, a stable and independent source of revenue. You may have read in the newspapers that my colleague, Supervisor Shimon Walton, and I, he is our representative on the Joint Powers Board, had a little mini battle with our counterparts in San Mateo County about having truly shared governance of that railroad system. We were able to reach a settlement that, together with our friends in Santa Clara County, resulted in truly a shared governance system. And this measure would actually relieve San Francisco of paying what last year was $15.6 million of money that would otherwise stay with Muni, because this would supplant that. I truly commend it to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it.
I don't think any questions on this, it doesn't look like. I want to go back. There was one question that popped up that I didn't get a chance to ask you, Supervisor. It relates back to Prop C. If we can go back all the way there. It's from Carol again. Regarding it, what changed your view? I think you mentioned something along the lines that you had been against it and now you're for it. Does that sound right?
No. I was my epiphany was actually a couple of 4 years ago over youth voting. In the case of Prop C, I came at it with a skeptical eye, but Sarah Souza and others, and being, the offspring of a first-generation immigrant to the United States, knowing that the immigrant experience is so important, and having the ability to have those views on advisory bodies, boards and commissions are advisory bodies, is actually, I think, something that is going to ultimately make us stronger. So no, I didn't change my mind on that. I entered it with a skeptical eye, but Ms. Souza convinced me. And Carol, Cap, I agree with you that it is hard to vote for a regressive tax. I do have a retort to that, but that's Prop RR.
All right. Let's see. Hey, well, listen, I think we did it. Only 34 minutes after. I definitely lowballed the amount of time that we would need for this. Thank you.
19 days and 1 hour until the polls close. If you don't trust the U.S. mail, there is a drop-off location that you can do by foot, by bus, by car, at the corner of Grove Street and Polk, kitty corner from City Hall, right in front of the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium. It is open 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. every weekday. Starting October 24th, will be open on the weekends from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. All 588 polling places in San Francisco will be open. Wear your mask, stay healthy, and thank you, everybody, for hanging in there during the pandemic.
And thank you, Supervisor Peskin, just for taking time. I mean, you gave us a hell of a lot of time here. This was incredibly educational, similar to how I felt at BCNA, both inspired and educated from this. So thank you very much. Thank you as well to everyone who joined us. Supervisor Peskin said it, Election Day, November 3rd. You should have your ballot in the mail. You should have received it by now. If you've got any questions, need help with this, email me, get in touch. Happy to help you. And lastly, I would just say, hey, if you enjoyed this event and would like to see more, or you simply want to support, please become a member of THD today. You can do so at thd.org. It's $35 a year. It enables us to do events like this. So thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Checks in the mail.